Hi, I'm Stacy Andersen, also known as the Supergene. Having lived in 9 cities across 3 continents and counting, Supergene Unleashed features people from around the world sharing their unfiltered versions of female empowerment. With a 20-year global career in digital marketing, operating as a leader and mentor, and now as a wife and mother of 3, I encourage you to unleash your own Supergene and become the most empowered version of yourself. Here's your advocate, ally, and confidant. I am ready to inspire you. Let's show the world what it's all about. Welcome back to Supergene Unleashed. Today, I'm joined by someone whose voice and vision are reshaping how we understand power, storytelling, and representation, especially for women of color across the global South. I met Scheherazade earlier this year at Web Summit in Doha, and we were both attending a podcasting workshop that was hosted by iHeart. And when we spoke, I was incredibly intrigued by her work, but more importantly, her purpose for women. She's a journalist, an academic, a storyteller, and the host of a powerful podcast herself titled 1001, which is a show that amplifies underrepresented voices through a lens that's global, honest, and unapologetically women-centered. Before we dive in, Scheherazade, I would love for you to introduce yourself in your own words, share who you are today, and what brought you to this moment in your journey.
Oh, thanks, Stacy. Yeah, I think you really summed it up, though, when you introduced me. It was so great to meet you at Web Summit. When you told me about Supergene, I was like, wow, this is fascinating. And in the back of my mind, I was like, I'd love to be on this podcast. And then it actually happened. So thank you for inviting me. I'm South African myself, and I grew up in South Africa, but I have, a varying background. My dad is mixed race. My mother is, her mother actually arrived in South Africa from Sri Lanka and was from like a Sri Lankan Burgher descent, which are also mixed race people. So people of Dutch, Portuguese, and Sri Lankan descent, Sinhalese descent as well. And then my dad, as I mentioned, he's got African, Indian, Yemeni descent. So, but growing up in South Africa, I just, I didn't have this sort of like these roots or identified with any roots. I was just like, me and working. And I never thought of myself as a woman of color in the space that I worked in, which was broadcast news. So I was in broadcast television. I started at Channel 5 in London straight after university and then got an internship back in South Africa. So went back to South Africa and then entered the fray of, TV news and really loved it at the time. I was so young, so I had all this energy. I'd never set out to, it was just the sort of rigmarole of going to work, doing the story, finishing the story, making sure, both sides of the story were shown. And I never thought to myself, well, I want to do this specifically about women, not at that stage anyway. And then I went into, from national news, moved to international news. So worked at various organizations in international news. And then realized, well, especially during COVID, I think everyone was listening to podcasts, including myself. And I was like, wow, I really would love to do more of this. I started researching audio journalism and just podcasting in general. Podcast studies doesn't go back too far, but there is some research on it. So I found that quite interesting. So I started this paper that I was writing as an academic. So I entered academia, just under 2 years ago, maybe just over 2 years ago. And started this paper, started interviewing. I found women I wanted to speak to and started interviewing them. And then I was like, wow, this what they're saying is so interesting. And they were the ones who actually said, well, I would love you to do a podcast about this. Like, where is this going? And I said, it's going in a paper. You're probably going to be referred to as participant. And they said, well, this is the story of our lives. We don't get the recognition we deserve. So we want you to do something with this. So I ended up doing a podcast. And for those who hadn't suggested that, I got the permission. And, so this is how I entered podcasting. So now I do this. As you said, I'm in academia. I do podcasts. I still do my freelance journalism from time to time, like on-screen video journalism, social media journalism. So yeah, I'm pretty busy.
Yeah, it really sounds like it. And it sounds like you have met so many diverse people throughout the history of your career, especially if you were in London and then you were back in South Africa, now being based in Doha, you must have interacted with so many different cultures and different backgrounds. What has really stood out to you in terms of the women that you have focused on? And, why do you think you said something that is a little bit sad that their story isn't out there? Why do you think these voices have often been left out or misrepresented?
You're right. I've met so many different women, and I think we all find this. You've also done the same, that our struggles or our stories are so similar, and we're all going through similar things. In terms of their stories, they have voices, they have their own platforms, but I think sometimes and for some of them, they have huge audiences, but it's quite niche audiences. And I think the main thing there is the recognition. Many of them are not getting the recognition they deserve. So there's this podcasting awards ceremony, which I speak about in my podcast. And, there are 12 winners and only 3 of them are people of color and only 2 of those are women of color. So What does success look like for them? For some of them, they're like, well, I don't care about those awards. I still consider myself a success. A lot of them call it a passion project. They're like, well, things that we really would love to do is not paying the bills. So we have to, do it as a side hustle, or whatever we do, we can't focus 100% on it. Or some of them that were able to had to be embedded in a different sort of organization for it to have traction. So, this is the story about them, is that they have voices and they have stories to tell. And then many of them that I spoke to said, well, sometimes the African story is not taken as seriously. So you spoke about the global South. The global South is so expansive, and it's still, there's another term for it, the majority world. And it is very expansive, but not all in the global South are even created equal. So at this moment in time, I am focusing on Southern Africa because I'm South African. This is the first phase of my project. But going forward, I would love to, speak to different kinds of women, different women in all over the globe, all over the global South. And even, within the global North, there is the global South. So you'll find that there'll be women, underprivileged women living all over the world, even in very high income countries. These are still the voices that I want to hear from and I want to put on my platform. So I feel like, I'm in a privileged place in that I worked at all these television stations. I built up I don't want to say following, but I built up this audience. I built up contacts and network. And I'm like, wow, from this place of privilege, how can I make sure that these women also get traction and are also on my platforms, and organizations that wouldn't ordinarily reach, say, the Middle East, because I'm now based here, organizations or voices or people that their voices, maybe the South African woman podcasting in South Africa. But like I said, and like we both know, their stories resonate with so many different people and echo with all kinds of women. So it should have a further reach. And how does that happen? Well, I'm hopefully trying to help that and promote it as much as I can.
Absolutely. You're serving as a conduit for these women to have greater reach and amplification. And I completely agree with you. It's also been within my experience meeting people around the world, specifically women, that largely there's a bit of universal truth in terms of the struggles that women face and the different obstacles that we have to, overcome and, really try to fight our way to be seen and be heard and be a part of that story. And so it really sounds like these women inspired you to recognize that because of your background and your career, you can be that amplification modality for them. And it sounds like that has helped you create your mission. So I want to ask you about specifically diving into your podcast and the research. So getting into more of the specific nuances that you've uncovered. What have you learned about the lived experiences of women of color, especially from places like South Africa? What are some of those concrete learnings that have come out of, your interactions with these women and even the podcast series that you've recently put out?
I just have to say I'm in absolute admiration of these women. Like, they have so much ambition. They have a clear idea of what they want to do with their lives. Some of them are single moms. Some of them have come from very poor backgrounds. Others haven't. I mean, not all of them have. We're not saying every single person that I speak to is underprivileged. That's not what it's about. South Africa is a higher income country on the African continent. But it's just that the space, just like the podcasting space all over the world, is dominated by white males. This is just how it is. And this is the same case in South Africa, which for me is ironic because South Africa is a majority country of Black people. So why then is this still happening like 30 years, it's like more than 3 decades post-apartheid. So for me, it's just mind-boggling that it's still happening. And whoever is giving this recognition, I think we need to relook at it. But at the same time, I mean, back to your question of what struck me about these women is that they're just inspirational. Like I was impressed by everything they do. Like one of them is, she just doesn't have a podcast. She also has a whole line of products. Another woman is like, her podcast stems from her PR agency. So they are so accomplished already and they're such high achievers and they never stop. Like the grind for them never stops. Like they're not people who, this is the reality of many of us. We experience so many things that hold us back, like anxiety or like, am I good enough? Imposter syndrome. And maybe they experienced that and they didn't all express that. But for many of them, they were like, I am who I am and I want to get my voice out there. And I have so much respect for other women. And it was just like about uplifting each other. Out of the 8 for season 1, I interviewed 8 of them. And out of 7 of the 8, mentioned about uplifting women and how proud they were of other South African women or other women out there in the world. So that was really an eye-opener for me that, there are so many people out there who support each other. And I spoke to a person, I won't name them, but they said to me, you don't want to go on about this woman of color. It becomes a trope after a while. And I was like kind of taken aback by that because I was like, what do you mean a trope? Like for you, maybe it's a trope as, somebody who's never had this lived experience. But this is the reality of the situation. These people are living this. This is, every day they want to have these podcasts, they want to produce. They may not have the money for equipment, or they're saving for they work in finance and then they're saving every month to buy this like state-of-the-art microphone or rent a podcast studio. Podcasting studios in South Africa are very, very expensive. Well, for people living there anyway. Obviously, if you went there, I think you'd think, wow, it's a great deal. But, for them, they want that high quality production value and they don't believe in, they have that much respect for their audience that they say, I'm going to give them the best. I'm giving them the best of me because that's who I want to portray, but also because I believe they deserve the best. So that was so amazing for me. And I love speaking to these women. I learned a lot from all of them.
Personally, I think that the person who questioned your focus on women of color actually substantiates why you should continue and why you should continue to focus on women of color, because comments like that, at least in my opinion, mean that clearly there is still a need to amplify these voices. I really appreciate hearing that these women also support other women, because sometimes I've experienced within my life women that have actually seemed to be out to get me in a way, or at least that was my interpretation of the situation. Maybe that wasn't their intention, of course, but that was my interpretation at the time. And it can be difficult because you do hear stories sometimes about women who aren't necessarily wanting to advocate for other women. And I think that the point in time that we are right now, we need to band together. We see so many different countries that are taking a step back in terms of equality for women and removing women's power of choice in what they, want to do with their body and how they want to live. So I honestly think now we have to keep pushing through and uniting and speaking up and empowering one another. I wanted to understand if you have identified any systemic barriers that these women are still facing, because you talked about how although the majority in South Africa are of color Black, that the majority of the podcasters are white men. And I also find that pretty alarming. what do you think it is that has given them the advantage over the minority within the media and storytelling spaces?
My research is still exploring this further because you have to do enough interviews, enough groundwork before you can put out, conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
But so far, what I've spoken to them about and what they've told me is access in terms of data. First of all, like data is not always readily available, or it's very expensive for them and even their audiences. So one of the podcasters I spoke to said, why would my audience pay $100 to subscribe to a podcast when they can use that $100 for something else, or they can just turn on the radio and listen to the radio for free? Like, what makes my podcast so unique or so important that they would spend that kind of money on me? So the same thing I grapple with as a podcaster. And I love that we're podcasters talking about podcasting on a podcast.
I know.
What I was saying is that, so this is the same thing I grapple with, is that I'm like, wow, Spotify and Apple. And I just saw something on LinkedIn by a very well-known podcast consultant saying, do you have your own website? When you send people a link to your podcast, is it to your website, or is it to Spotify or Apple or YouTube? Are you redirecting them somewhere else? And the thing is, the majority of people say Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. So they are doing that. They don't have their own website, not as many as should. So we should have our own website for sure, where we post all of this. But at the same time, what we should do is we should put it on platforms that are highly accessible to the people we want to hear it as well, to the people we're talking about. So the third platform I have my podcast on is AfriPods. Okay. And that is the largest audio listening space on the continent. And it is a lot more accessible to the people living on the continent. So the other systemic barriers the woman spoke about was, there was, at the time of some of the podcast interviews, load shedding was a huge issue in South Africa. So there would be power cuts. And then one woman said, I'm embarrassed. Like I'm going to interview a guest in America, and here I am sitting in the dark. So I will reschedule because I don't want it to be embarrassing for me. So I said, well, this is your reality of your situation. What about just letting them know this is what it's like living here? And this is real, and it's just so raw. And they said, well, for me, it's not professional, and I don't want them to think less of me. So I think, that's not a systemic barrier. That's a psychological barrier. There were a few of those that cropped up, and another woman saying, I love my audio podcast because I don't have to put on makeup. I don't have to dress up. I can be in my pajamas, and she's like, I love that about podcasting. I don't feel that pressure of looking a certain way and people judging me by my appearance. And by the sound of my voice, they don't know what race I am, how old I am, my sexuality. And she said, I love that about podcasting. But yeah, back to the systemic barriers, apart from data, a lot of them said, we have no governmental support. The others saying, we do everything by ourselves because of financial constraints. So we're the editors, we upload. I mean, a lot of us do that anyway, but, they also have their full-time jobs. So they're trying to do this. They're trying to be parents. They're trying to make sure their podcast has reach. So they're also promoting their podcast by themselves. But what is unique to South Africa, this is something not unique, I think, to people who have podcasts as passion projects and still have to continue working, is that, again, it's like I'm in a majority country, but my voice is not represented as the majority on these podcasting platforms.
Yeah, I really was unaware, didn't certainly think about the possibility about data and load issues or even power cuts. It is a true reality. Obviously, I'm living in Dubai and I work with many different people across the region, and in specific countries, there have been times where they have faced these realities, but I can definitely say that most people in America probably don't realize that this is something that happens and could be a blockade. We just kind of take things for granted. So I really appreciate that these women have such resilience to not let that stand in their way of pursuing their passion project, especially as you say that it is their passion project. I want to shift a little bit more to the name of 1001. What does the name reflect related to your vision, and how did you come up with the name? Do you plan to interview 1001 people?
I thought of that. I was like, this will never happen because I did the calculations. I was like, I don't know if I'll live that long. So this is why, it's 1001 voices, because maybe I'm going to have like more than one voice. Not maybe, I will be having more than one voice per podcast. And it's 1001 ideas. It's just the whole attachment of Scheherazade, who was a princess who told these tales to save her life and save the life of the woman of the land. So if you look it up, you'll be able to read about her. And she told 1001 tales. And yeah, it's just that I just thought it went perfectly with me as being the host, and just the idea of, this catchy number and having these women come on, and the way it worked so well with, I don't know if you saw my logo that was designed by a very, very adept student who's really good at graphic design. And it's two AirPods that form the zeros. So, and then the ones on either side. So it just worked out so well, I think, in terms of a visual appeal as well.
I also love how it ties into your name. Have you received any feedback from listeners? And are there moments that have moved you in ways that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I think it's early days still. And I spoke to, this is one of the questions I ask my podcasters. And they all said, I get stopped in the street and they say, thank you for that. You really touched a nerve. You really helped me. Somebody said, you uplifted me when I was going through a dark time. But for me, it's early days. In terms of people, yeah, of course, people have been messaging me, whoever I share it with. Somebody commented on the Spotify platform and they said they love it and they had no idea. Like you, they had no idea that these women who are podcasting in South Africa are not getting the recognition they deserve. So I think it's definitely like the more the more we produce, the more traction we get, the more listeners we get, then the more responses we will have. So for my season 2 that's coming up, I've already done the interviews, but be showcasing, the lives of these young women living on the Cape Flats ganglands. And as part of the podcast, I interviewed journalists who'd covered violence and crimes on the Cape Flats, on the ganglands. And they, there was a little soundbite from them, but then season 3 is the full episode speaking to these journalists, these South African women journalists who covered this dangerous area. And some of them even grew up there. So, this is quite an interesting sort of projection, like, going from the podcasters to the young woman and then to the journalists who featured in the episodes with the young women. And then also the fact that for the young woman, because that was the main the crux of that project, is that this is a video as well. So it's a first person narrative where they look directly into the camera. So the connection is there with the audience and they're speaking to the audience and saying, this is my story. These are my hopes and dreams. I have the same hopes and dreams as any other young woman living anywhere in the world. And then I hope to follow up with them, hear from them again, because this all stemmed from a digital skills workshop I did in Cape Town last summer. And then the whole point of it was to say, here are the skills, go ahead and be your own producers, get your footage. And then once you feed it back to me, I'll put it all together for you and we have a nice piece. And you're a producer as well on this. So it's for them to give them hope and give them this credit that they may not have got when they hadn't maybe had access to platforms like this. And then there were so many barriers for them that many of them, I think it was only one of the 6 girls that actually, or maybe it was more than 6, but one of the girls only were able to get B-roll. So now we have to move on to plan B. But this is the thing, is that it's not easy. Even if you have the skills, you may not be able to go out into a community that's not willing for you to, tell the story. Or they're like, who are you to be telling the story? So if I went in as a journalist and they know me from, when I used to go in as an E-News TV reporter and I'd go into the Cape Flats, they would happily tell me things and let me film and so on, because, I'm linked to this news organization. But what happens to these young women who are just by themselves? And, I don't want to put them in any danger. They're telling their own stories about their own lives, but they still, maybe they don't have the confidence as well. So that didn't happen, but it will, hopefully this is the next phase.
That's actually what I was going to ask you, is if any of these women felt afraid to open up like that and to go into this area. But it sounds like they put any of those fears aside and still chose to move forward, which is incredibly commendable because that couldn't necessarily have been the easiest thing to decide to go in there.
Sorry, if you don't mind me just saying something about that,
Yeah.
because I think, responsible journalism for me is so important. And a lot of people will report on young people, they'll report on vulnerable people and then not protect them. And for me, it was very important to make sure that these women were 18 or over. So there were people in the workshop that were younger, but there are all kinds of issues with now exposing these young people. And then speak to their parents, even though they were 18, they don't need any sort of parental signatory or anything. I still wanted their parent to be there. So their parent came to the shoot, and anything they were uncomfortable about saying after they said it, I said to them, well, what would you like me to leave out? And they told me, sometimes you think to yourself, well, then is it the real story? Is it the full story? There's a mission. But at the same time, you have to ensure that you're, reporting responsibly and making these young women feel like, okay, you're putting my voice out there, but am I protected? Am I vulnerable now? Or is this, going to boost me into bigger things, which is a lot of them wanted this. And a lot of their parents were like, well, they wouldn't get this opportunity. They wouldn't get this opportunity to tell who they are, speak about who they are, and let others, further afield know what they're going through as well.
Yeah, that's really great. And it's especially wonderful that you obviously are maintaining ethics with respect to the work that you do. And I'm sure that that's something that you have always maintained throughout your career. And especially in the world that we live in today with, everything being digital first and sort of having a permanence in terms of forming a public profile about who you are in a digital profile. I mean, I saw something super scary the other day where it was a demo of somebody asking about, a person to chat GPT. And it came back and it was able to put together a biography based on all of the different things that, that it could connect to. So you absolutely have to be cognizant and think twice about your digital image and what you want to put out there.
It's funny you say that because my son did this yesterday.
He did?
He asked ChatGPT about me, and it had pulled everything from LinkedIn, from any biographies that were written online, but they were also hallucinations. So I think it said something about, yeah, and it also called me a prominent figure. I was like, am I? Oh, okay, thanks.
That's complimentary.
I know, that was amazing. I was like, oh, maybe someone else wrote that about me. But yeah, there were a few hallucinations. So I said to my son, no, I've never done that. Or I don't know about that one, So it is so important, like you say, the digital footprint, but also like using when you use a large language model to try to find information, I think it's tricky because you have to double check it.
Oh, for sure. And obviously there's so much fraud that happens as well with deep fakes and, people creating things about others to not use in a positive way. But nonetheless, I'm really excited to listen to when season 2 is released. I want to dig a little bit into the personal side of things and know, what have you personally learned or unlearned through this work?
At the beginning, I really thought I would go into it. Like I said, if you listen to season 1, you'll hear that it's not a traditional podcast. Maybe it's not, the audio is not as crisp or some of it. That was never the intention, for it to be a podcast when I recorded it. And then these women, to go back to them and say, oh, can we re-record it now? They don't always have this time on their hands. They're very
And the
busy.
story wouldn't have been repeated as you wanted.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been as authentic. And then I think what surprised me was that, I've said it before, is that they said, well, put us out there, do it. Like, I didn't think many of them would want to, or since they've already got their own podcasts, I thought, oh, well, some of them might want the story for their platform. But they're not like that at all. They're like, well, let's get it on all platforms. Let's get our story, wherever. So wherever you think is fitting. So that was surprising to me. It was surprising that they were so open, but it's surprising also that some of them had such, I don't want to say low confidence, but like question themselves, like whether they were good enough. Like when you hear them, you think, wow, they are so confident. Like when you listen to their podcast. And then when you speak to them and they tell you, well, actually, I went through a lot. Like I struggled with depression, or I had, I was going through so much, or somebody passed away that week and I still managed to do that episode. And again, like you mentioned the resilience, I don't know if it surprises me because I've covered, as you say, I've discovered so many stories about people who are resilient and against all odds succeed and become so successful. But it's still, I think I am still surprised, actually, because you think, well, somebody's gone through that, but it can still keep you down, but it doesn't. And then it just helps me because sometimes you question yourself as well, and you're like, well, am I doing the right thing? Or should I stick to TV because that's what I know best? But then you're like, well, if they can do it, I can do it. We're all out there. We're all doing this and trying our best. And, there's a reason, because multi-platform reach is great. It's ideal for reaching more and more audiences.
Yeah, it definitely brings accessibility to the message, and, them being so vulnerable in sharing their, mental struggles and some of their fears and questioning, their own capability, yet they have such an exterior facade of utmost confidence. It is a little bit consoling in a way to hear that, because sometimes when I've met people that appear so incredibly confident, I always wonder, do they ever question their capability? Do they ever have moments where they have an internal fear that maybe holds them back? Because I've certainly grappled with that throughout my life, where I have felt quite particular or really felt compelled to do something or say something, and had a lot of excitement brew inside of me. But then there's this quiet little voice inside that steps in and says, oh, can you really do this? Or should you really do this? And what's nice is that these women are serving as an inspiration that, yes, you can. And it doesn't really matter what background that you've had, that when you have a purpose and you follow that purpose, you should go for it, and you shouldn't feel afraid and listen to that little inner voice. I know that you're a mother, as am I, and I want to know, because obviously we both focus on women, and I'm a newer mom, so it's definitely changed my perspective becoming a mom and having my own daughter. What role has motherhood played in shaping your perspective? And I know that you have a daughter as well, and I think that she recently graduated. How does it change how you approach your work?
I woke up this morning and I think we always ask ourselves this question. Like you say, my son's going to be 20 this year. My daughter's graduated. And I opened my eyes and I thought, have I been a good mom to them? And am I a good girl mom? You do always ask yourself that, because sometimes, you think that when a woman has a daughter, like her perspective will change, but that's not always the case. Like you'll meet women out there who are just, you mentioned these women who don't want you to come up in life, or maybe it feels like that. Maybe they're intimidated, or maybe they just don't want anyone else to feature as, the first woman of this, and you think that, but you ask yourself, those women were raised by women.
Yeah.
But what kind of woman raised those women? That is the question. I think my daughter, we've never ever mentioned you're a girl, or, this is how you should be. This is how your brother should be. And with her, it hasn't changed the way I raise kids because of the way I was raised. Like my dad didn't have any sisters and he wished he had. And when he raised me, he always said to me, you should never rely on anybody for anything. Don't rely on a man for anything. And just, it's just you out there against the world, really. So he made me always never think of myself as having any limitations as being a woman. So if they were, I don't even know if I noticed it, to be honest. Like only looking back now, I'll look and think, well, maybe that was why it happened. And I think in high school, a teacher once said to me, well, you'll never understand physics because you're a woman, and that
my goodness.
That shocked me because I was like, what? This is the first time anyone has told me something like this. Like I'm horrified, but I didn't do anything about it because, I was scared of my physics teacher and want to make trouble, like, you know how you are when you're really young. But having a daughter, like, I look at her and I always think, this is how I wish I'd been at her age. Like, she's so confident, mashallah, she's so beautiful. I love everything about her. I'm inspired by both my children. And they're very, very different. Like, she is so confident. Like, I've never really worried about her. But then there are times I realize, like, she definitely needs her mom. Like, I think every woman needs that nurturing from their mother to really, like, succeed in life. And just know that, in tough times, there's that woman that you can turn to for nurturing advice, or someone that loves you unconditionally. And sadly, not everybody has that. Like, it's not that easy. Not that
so
easy.
true. And that is a sad reality. But I really appreciate what your father said about it's only you in this world, because that is a mantra that I hold near and dear to my heart. Is I think it's incredibly important for women, especially, to be self-sufficient, maintain a certain level of independence. That doesn't mean that you can't have a partner that you rely on, but that you need to be fulfilled in yourself, be it with your career, monetarily. And I also love that your daughter has so much confidence, because certainly not everybody has the privilege of being raised in an environment that shapes that type of confidence and kind of, I can do anything in this world. And it's so exciting. And I'll be so curious to see what she does in the coming years. As a closing, I want to know, what message would you leave women listening today with, especially those who are trying to claim their space but feel unseen?
Yes, I'm going to give the advice that I give my students, that I've lived by. And, it's not like original words, but I think it's Theodore Roosevelt. I don't know if it's the ideal person to quote, but comparison is the thief of joy. And I say this all the time, like, so many of us compare ourselves to others, and we'll go on social media, we'll go on LinkedIn, or we'll do something and we'll say, oh, look how much they've accomplished. Look what they've done. I need to be like that, or I need to do the same amount of work to get the same recognition. And each of our stories is unique to us. And I don't think we should ever try to be like someone else, or compare ourselves, or try to keep up with somebody else's, like, life story, or accomplishments or achievements, because that will just weigh you down. It will make you lose focus, and you won't know where you're going in life, because there's so much noise. And the other thing is, if you are going to compete with somebody in life, make it be you. Like, compete with yourself. That's what I would say. Always try to be a better version of you. So that's what I've always tried to do. Hopefully,
I love that advice. Actually, this is the advice that I needed to hear today, to be honest with you. I feel motivated about what I'm trying to do with this show, and feel encouraged that I should keep going, because you're right. Everyone has a different voice. Everyone has a different story, and there's always going to be an audience that it resonates with. So what's next for you? What are you dreaming? What are you daring towards next? And how can people find you?
So I am on LinkedIn. A lot of my social media accounts are private. So
Okay.
just I don't post anything, work related or relate to my projects. It's like a picture of my kids or something. But yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn. What's next for me? I've got these 2 seasons coming up, and then the video project. So I'm very excited about those. I continue to do my research on audio journalism and podcasting in general. So I'm also thrilled about working more towards that, because I'm going to be presenting some of this work. I presented it at the African Women in Media Conference, and also will be presenting in Singapore next month at one of the conferences. So that's going to be the research presentation. So yeah, keep doing these kinds of things. And then I think, again, like, I know I said this earlier, so I want to just clarify that I said each of our stories is unique, but at the same time, no story is truly original. So I think it's just told differently. So, this is why we say things resonate with us, because, I have that same struggle, but it's not exactly the same, but, I can relate. So I think it's important to think, because a lot of us try to say, oh, well, if this is my idea, my podcast about women podcasting. And I had one woman who I reached out to because she's a podcaster. And I said, can I interview you? And she said, well, I've already done something like this. I've already made a YouTube video about this. So I said, oh, that's awesome. Like, I'll quote you. I'll use your work as well. But she was, there are people who are almost protective of their ideas, or they think, this is my idea. Nobody else should try to, piggyback on it. But it's not about that. It's about, let's just pool our ideas. Let's work together. And you have this amazing podcast. I think I love the idea of it, Supergene. And I really can't wait to hear the others and hear what other women have had to say. And nobody's going to say something completely original, but it's going to be from a different mouth and a different voice. So I'm going to love it. So I know that.
Absolutely. It's the lens that we put on it. Each person may encounter a very similar thing in life. It's the way that they interpret that experience that does bring that uniqueness. Scheherazade, thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to listening to 1001, the next episodes. And thank you again for joining Supergene Unleashed.
Thanks, Stacy. It's been a pleasure being.
Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope you feel empowered from the episode. You can connect with me at supergeneunleashed.com and on Instagram at supergeneunleashed. Please share your thoughts, and I look forward to connecting with you. And until next time, keep on shining and showing the world your supergene.